Hi, good morning, and welcome to the final day of this excellent conservation symposium. My name is ASSAF SHWARTZ, and I would like to speak today about conservation outside protected areas. I would like to speak about the challenges and the solutions in designing multifunctional landscapes for mutual benefits of people and biodiversity. Now, since a picture worth 1,000 words, I would like to show you two pictures. One of them of a traditional solution, engineering solution of a canal lining, or the multifunctional solutions. For instance, using natural vegetation to slow down water, enhance biodiversity, and provide recreational activities. So this seems like an excellent solution, but in fact, in reality, it's a bit more challenging than we would like it to be. So this will be the topic of my talk, but I would like to start with a bit of background. Human appropriation of natural resources, as you all know, has led to a huge biodiversity crisis. Now, human activity is the cause of this crisis, and therefore the solution to it would largely depend on the way we will behave in the future and our ability to raise strong public support to encourage our governments to act. The problem is that the same processes that threatens biodiversity, such as urbanization, or agricultural intensification, also modify the way people experience nature in their daily life. Now, this is an issue. In 1978, Robert Pyle coined the term the extinction of experience to describe this phenomena. He argued that lack of opportunity to experience nature, and reduced affinity to nature, change our nature interaction, and this has severe consequences, as we all know today, on our health, well-being, attitudes toward nature conservation, and our behavior, as I said before. Now, in a previous paper, we looked at this theoretical model as a whole and actually find strong support for these relations. Now, if you think about it, even protected areas, which are the key tool in conservation, the areas which are most biodiversity rich, are also to an extent reducing people's experience of nature. At least in Israel, in protected area, you're not allowed to touch nature too much, and you have to keep your distance. So in a way, even us as conservationists, we can reduce nature interactions. Speaking about protected areas, much of the effort in conservation goes towards protected areas, and although the area is going up and cover more and more, both in terrestrial and marine areas, still biodiversity crisis persist. And we, in a few years ago, we did this paper which analyze the protected areas network in England, and we showed, like in many other places in the world, that first of all they cover only 6.37% of the terrestrial land, and in fact in the last 15 years it didn't really change. Changes were really small. Of course, it's a network of small, fragmented areas which are often located in places which are remote that nobody wants. And what happened outside those areas, outside those small protected areas, is actually influencing what happened inside those protected areas. This was few of the reasons why this network is not functioning, and it's led many ecologists to think we need to scale out of protected areas. We need to expand the toolbox. And for what expand the toolbox? For these multifunctional landscapes. They are complementing efforts to protected areas, but the idea is they can provide environmental, social, and economic benefit. And again, in the same paper, we looked at this large-scale initiative in England. There's few, or actually very different types of initiatives, all marked in different shade of green and a bit of yellow. So these are all different type of large-scale conservation initiative in England, and we showed that these are unrealized. This had unrealized potential. The reason they have unrealized potential is because on one hand we marked a nice polygon on a map, but in fact inside those polygons nothing really happened, and we are failing to balance between human needs and biodiversity conservation. If you ask yourself why, what are the challenges? And I think when we talk about multifunctional landscape, we talk about so many functions. So as ourselves as ecologists, we talk a lot about biodiversity conservation, but we can think about energy and pollution, water, etc., etc. There are many benefits. We're always trying to balance all of them together. But in fact, all these functions can even conflict or trade-offs. There are synergies between those functions, and nature, which is often assumed as panacea, is not. So if we protect nature, it's not necessarily, or so one type of nature, not necessarily benefit one of those functions I mentioned here before. Another issue is that solutions are often context specific. So what will be good for Israel will not going to be good for South Africa, or what good for Israel in urban area will be completely wrong in agriculture area. And this is kind of made me think about this issue and think what we need, or how can we promote multifunctional landscape. So the first thing I would like to say is we need to remember that in multifunctional landscapes, humans are the keystone species in those areas. These are human-dominated landscapes, and therefore we need to explore human needs, their attitudes, behavior, benefits, and of course nature interaction, which is really important. The other thing is that we should not look for one size fits all solution. We need to tailor a solution for context specific, and definitely understand trade-offs and synergies between different solutions. And finally, what I really believe now is that we need to look for opportunities to maximize a selected core benefits that we really need for a given objective. And what I would like to do in the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes is to take you through my research in agriculture areas, in urban areas, and a bit about connecting people to nature, and show you these opportunities and what we can achieve with multifunctional landscapes. So I would like to start providing a few examples of these opportunities with this beautiful picture. So this picture was taken from the Gilboa mountain, just looking at the beautiful Jezreel Valley in the east side of Israel, an intensively cultivated area which actually separates two large and important ecoregions, the Sumeria mountain and the lower Galilee, or the Galilee mountain. You can see it here in red in the right hand side. In the map of the study area, which is about 100 square kilometers, you can see the green areas, different shade of green, are different type of protected areas, and almost no protected areas within the study area. And we were asked by the Israeli Nature and Park Authority to think about designing an ecological corridor, restoring habitat as an ecological corridor to allow passage and connection between these two important ecoregions. And we thought about two alternatives. One alternative is to use stream restoration, restore some dry rivers beds, and one large corridor, so taking a lot of part of the fields and restore them, or looking at the whole landscape and implementing very few environmental friendly practices to restore habitat. One of them was the restoration of field margin, so all the fields in the area have margins, but most of them are cultivated, one field touches another, and we checked the opportunity of restoration of field margin as a more multifunctional landscape approach. In this area, when you can still find few field margin. What the farmers doing into these field margins, they actually abuse them. They employ herbicide, just to destroy the field margin. And what we did in our experiment was to do it in half of the field. We did that. In the other half, we kept the vegetation, and then we looked at 11 fields of wheat and 3 fields of tomatoes, and trying to see what this has an effect on the yield, natural enemies, pest and damage, which was tested in the lab from fruits taken from the fields, rodents, weeds, and as biodiversity indicator, we used a butterfly again, and we did it in transects from 1 meter all the way to 50 meter into the field. So I'm not going to present the whole result, just a brief summary. And again, what you see, first thing is that for rodents, there was no effect. So the fact that you did not destroy the field margin, or you have a vegetated field margin, has no effect on rodents. We did, however, find an effect of weeds. So we have more weeds in wheat fields, but in tomato, we got the opposite effect, significantly lower rate of weeds in tomato crops. When you look at natural enemies, that was clear, positive. You got more natural enemies in the wheat and in the tomato crops. And damage, we can only look for damage in tomato crops. And then we thought it was actually reduced, most probably because of these natural enemies. Now, the bottom line, what the farmer cares about, the yield. Even though there was an increase in weeds, there was no difference, no effect on the yield altogether. And for the tomato, as expected, we got higher yields. Finally, biodiversity. Field margin can actually increase biodiversity in terms of species diversity, richness, and abundance. So how can we summarize all these? So first of all, field margin provide, as far as we saw in our context, more benefit than damage, and this is especially true for tomato, when here we have a win-win opportunity, a win-win for the farmer and for biodiversity conservation. Now, but what we really care about was to know whether these opportunities actually, if you look at the whole landscape, what is better for the big margin, as I said before, or to move for this many practices, or in this case many field margins across the landscape. And that's why we did a huge survey of 96 points throughout the landscapes. We sampled birds, butterfly, plants, and different type of arthropods. We also made an economic survey. We collect information from farmers about yields, input, outputs, their practices, of course, and profit. And again, I will briefly take you through the results. What you see here is the response ratio. If it's positive, it means it's a positive effect. If it's different than 0, it's significant. And in general, what you can see is that when you compare the cultivated areas to the field margin, there is generally a positive trend. And here we look at different seasons. We look at the fall, at the spring, and at the summer. And in general, the trends are positive. And if you summarize it all, it's increased something like 64% of biodiversity with this very narrow 6-10 meters field margin. Now, when you compare the semi-natural area, which are larger, to the field margin, you get, of course, the opposite trend, mostly negative. It varies again in season, it varies in between taxa. I'm not going to get into it, but in general we get a reduction of about 20%. So the semi-natural has less benefit, has more benefit than the field margin. Now, to look at the economy, it's becoming a bit more complicated. We look at the proportion of uncultivated area, the field margin around each of our crops. We looked at different type of crops, whole landscape, very common crops that altogether represent about 70 to 80% of the mosaic of agriculture. We look at wheat, rain-fed, irrigated, watermelon, tomatoes, and orchards, different type of orchards, and we calculated the loss. I'm not going to get into the economic side of things, but we calculate the loss in two scenarios. One scenario is conversion of the crop to natural area, or establishing field margin with around the plots or within the plots for orchards. And our results could help us develop an indicator of cost effectiveness. So the effectiveness in this case is only ecological effectiveness, and the cost is the cost to the farmer, either the fact that he lose the land or having to arrange or restore weeds and the damage associated with it. And we find very interesting results. First of all, as we saw and expected for the following the tomato experiment, we see that for tomato and citrus, orange, we have a win-win situation. We got a moderate ecological benefit for this field margin practice, but since the costs, actually they're not only costs, they've economic benefits to having field margin, it actually makes it much more cost effective than the other alternative of restoring semi-natural habitats. So actually it's good for the farmer. If you look at the more extensive crops like the rain-fed wheat and the olive orchards we had in the valley, we found actually no big difference, but for some other crops like the watermelon, the almonds, and the irrigated wheat, in this case there was, if you look at the whole landscape, there was some kind of a cost, and in this case the semi-natural habitat approach was much better. So it's actually a question. It's not an ecological question, it's an economic question. What's better for the economy? What's the best practice? What's the mosaic of different crops in your area could help you make this decision? What's the best strategy to develop an ecological corridor? Still, nevertheless, highlighting some win-win opportunities. In some vegetable, definitely it's worth implementing field margin. So from this ecological corridor, I would like to move to another excellent example, which is the olive orchards. Now, olive orchards in Israel represent about 11% of agriculture area in the whole country and 32% of orchards. They are not only important crop, they also represent a heritage and cultural landscape, which is important for many people in Israel and throughout the Middle East. Now, what's happening in the last several years, we're seeing a process of intensification. So the traditional farming is almost lost, like very scattered trees, use of herding for grazing is almost getting lost. Instead, we're getting the extensive, what is very commonly practiced in the Arabic areas in Israel. And over there is a rain-fed crops you see here, and in this case they employ both herbicides and working with machinery, which wasn't done before, unlike the traditional one. There is more and more organic orchards. Again, here there is an irrigation, but of course using organic practices, so no chemicals, and the intensive and even today super intensive agriculture in olives that meant only for product with a lot of inputs, a lot of chemicals, almost nothing grows there. So we wanted to compare this different level of intensity, and we picked up 50 plots in the lower Galilee, representing the 5 level of intensity, and 12 natural controls, so natural areas close to those plots. We did an ecological survey of birds and plants. And we did a social online survey with 300 participants, which represented the sample of Israeli adult population. And we asked them many things, but mostly we asked them to rank 30 images we took from the orchard itself, from the different orchards, either inside the orchards or above the orchards, using drones, and asked them to rate to what extent they like the landscape in the picture. Would you like to spend time in this, so kind of recreational question, cultural services, and to what extent they feel connected to this landscape. Finally, we had interviews with 12 farmers to take again information about yields, input, output, profit, etc. Now the results are very interesting. First, from ecological perspective, you can see here the orange. We're looking here just at richness, but the results are similar for other indicators. So the control for plants was dramatically higher than all the cultivated area. But look at the traditional, somewhere in between, significantly lower, but somewhere in between the organic and the extensive, further in between, and finally in the intensive and super intensive, really, really low. In birds, it was slightly different. The traditional and control were very similar in terms of bird richness and composition, and extensive and organic were also intermediate, and again the lowest bits were the intensive and the super intensive, as you can see here in the images. From social perspective, we also saw a decreased trend going from traditional to super intensive. People really liked the traditional, to lesser extent the extensive, but definitely liked the organic, and really did not like the intensive and super intensive. Similar trend was recorded. They want to spend time in this, especially the traditional one, and they felt connected to traditional, extensive, organic, but to really dramatically lesser extent the intensive and super intensive. Now from the economy perspective, we find that differences in yield, and here you can see that the traditional and extensive has a very, very small yield compared to the organic and intensive, which were similar. We were surprised. We expect the yield to be lower in the organic orchards. And when we look at the profit, actually here we got an interesting trend. Again, almost no profit for traditional and extensive, but the organic, because the product price is higher, the profit for the farmer is higher. So if you're doing organic, you're doing much more than the intensive and super intensive plots. And again, it's important to flag that the traditional and extensive have almost no profit, especially the extensive. So people don't really, even in some cases, they lose money. So how can we take these complex results into something coherent? So looking at the traditional ones, these are getting disappeared from Israel all over the world, and they have high ecological value, as we showed you. They have high cultural values, poor economical value. So in that case, I think what's important is the government should come and thinking about preserving this traditional landscape as a heritage or cultural reserve, and basically invest in this. This is a high value. On the other hand, so this is not an opportunity, there is an investment needed. When you look at the extensive, we have an areas which are poor ecological economic value. They're cultivated mostly for cultural reason, and their ecological value is intermediate or even low. And therefore, I think with a bit of support of the government, because anyway, people don't intend to profit too much from these orchards, with a bit of subsidies and guidance, maybe you can persuade farmers to move to more environmental agriculture, less machinery, less pesticides, and increase the ecological quality of these habitats. Again, in the organic, represent the win-win opportunities, high ecological, high cultural. In this case, what we need is simply to encourage farmer to move to organic. So this is something the government Israel does not do at the moment, and for me this is a great opportunity, win-win opportunity to enhance the quality of the landscape in Israel. Anyway, intensive farmers are losing money at the moment compared to organic ones. So from the rural areas, I would like to move now to the urban areas, which have a very different situation, but still lots of opportunities. So urbanization, as we know, delete and degrade natural ecosystem, resulting very rapid species extinctions, but also, as I said before, separate people from experience of nature, and this influence their attitudes and opinions towards nature conservation, and therefore influence species extinctions. Now, this extinction of experience also reduces the psychological benefit, social benefit, and physiological benefit that nature provides, and therefore can impact people's well-being. So if this is the problem, if you think about multifunctional landscapes, we have a great solution. Let's enhance biodiversity, and this will be a great win-win solution. We will reduce species extinctions, increase well-being, connect people to nature, and basically align the agenda of public health and conservation. And I wish I could say this is completely working or working 100%. Because a few years ago, I did a systematic review covering almost 800 papers showing that there is not too much knowledge, or actually little empirical knowledge to support this idea. And since then, I'm studying these relations. And specifically today, I would like to talk about relationship between biodiversity and well-being. How does biodiversity relate to well-being? So for biodiversity, we study species richness and abundance. And I will focus today on species richness. For well-being, which is a more complex concept, there are different components that influence our well-being. Our personal security, our personal health, financial security. But most of literature is focusing on the contribution of nature to subjective well-being. So how good we feel, how good we report we feel. And in that regard, there are several theories in relation to that, and there are several tools that already been developed in regarding the contribution of nature to our ability to reflect and gain perspective, reflection, a degree of emotional connection to a place, or sense of identity with place or with the past. All these been shown to be influenced by nature. And I was interested to see how biodiversity or species richness can influence them. There was already few studies that did it before we did it, mostly in Anglo-Saxon culture. Rich, Fuller, and Tal looked at green spaces in Sheffield, England, and found that subjective well-being was related to habitat diversity, plant, bird richness, but not to butterfly diversity. And he also found that perceived richness for all taxa was positively related to observed richness, so what people managed to perceive what there really was there in the green spaces. Gary Luke and his colleague at 2011 looked at the different scale, neighborhood scale, and found relationship between subjective well-being, birds, and plant richness. But when they put inside demographic variables like income, education, gender, etc., all those relationship with biological variable disappeared, and they remain only with the demographic variables. Finally, Martin Dolimers and colleagues look at riparian area again in Sheffield, England, and did not find any relationship between components of subjective well-being, birds, butterfly, and plant diversity. They also did not find a relationship between the perceived richness and the sample richness. But when they look at the components of subjective well-being in relating to the perceived richness, so what people perceive to have in this riparian area, they find a positive a correlation. The richer the riparian area were perceived, the more benefit that they provided. So I wanted to replicate this study in Israel. I took a coastal plain in Netanya, just north of Tel Aviv, and focused on 24 small small public garden, very small, to about 2 hectares. We sampled birds, butterflies, and plants like people before us, and we ran 600 questionnaires in the sites, in the garden, to collect the garden's contribution to subjective well-being, following Fuller et al., the perceived richness, so what the richness people perceive to have, ecological knowledge. We gave people a picture of the 12 most common plants, butterflies, and bird species, and calculated their ecological knowledge. Their emotional connection to nature. We used nature relatedness scale to measure this important variable. And finally, as we saw, demographic variables are crucial, and we collected them and used linear model to look for relationships. So the results are rather complex. First of all, we found no effect of ecological knowledge unexpectedly on the relationship between perceived and sample richness, but we did find that nature relatedness actually moderated the relation between perceived and sample richness. So people who are very highly connected to nature, here in green, about 17%, 27% of the population, for them, they managed to perceive the garden rich when they were rich and poor when they were poor. For the majority of the population, here in red, And this is for plants, butterfly, and birds. Majority of the population, there was no effect. And for those who have low emotional connected to nature, when the garden were rich, they perceived them as poor, and when the garden were poor, they perceived them as rich. And this was an interesting. We also found no direct relation between subjective well-being and species richness, similar to Martin Dolimer, and we find a strong relation between garden size. So bigger garden provide more well-being. No effect of ecological knowledge, so the knowledge you have on species does not influence your benefit in terms of subjective well-being. And again, the emotional relation to nature became really, or shown to be really important for different taxa. Again, butterflies, they are indicated by those icons. And what you see here is, and again on the right, y-axis is the component, and people who are highly connected to nature, positive, if they perceive the garden to be richer, or if the garden was sampled and had richer biodiversity, they benefited more from the garden, from butterflies, trees, plants, etc. And as you see here, for the people who have low connection to nature or poor, that was the opposite trend. And for the majority of the population, 56%, it was somewhere in the middle, so no effect. So what do I take home from this complex result? First of all, that biodiversity and well-being relationship is not as straightforward as we would like them to be, and unlike what is found for relationship between nature or even green and health and well-being, for biodiversity it's more complex, and this should be considered. And we need to recognize that, again, one size may not fit all, and some people can even suffer from rich gardens, and therefore when we want to promote some policies, we need to be very careful. On the other hand, urban ecologists often talk about enhancing biodiversity, but I would argue this is not enough. We need to think also about how to connect people to nature, how to establish stronger connection, to have some meaningful interaction that foster this connection. And the last part of my talk, very briefly, I would like to talk about some ways to enhance meaningful interaction with nature. And this is an experiment we did 2 years ago in the campus at the Technion where I work. We asked students to walk for 30 minutes outside in green spaces, and we randomly assigned them to 9 different conditions, which we called cues to experience. So very, very simple. We asked some of them, of course, no control, no conditions. Others were asked to observe wildlife, smell flowers, listen to sounds, take pictures of nature, walk more slowly, touch elements of nature, explore many areas, and turn off your phone. After the walk, we measured their nature interaction, checked it was yes, no question. Did you see a bird? Did you smell a flower? Etc. etc. And we also measured the positive and negative affects, so how they felt, how good they felt and bad they felt after the walk. What we found was very interesting. We find stronger effect of those cues to experience that reduce physical distance from nature. So the one that requires people to touch, really touch, get down and touch nature, smell flowers, take pictures and observe wildlife, and to stronger extent touch and smell, resulted that the people interacted more with nature. So those people who asked to touch also observed more, smelled more, listened more, etc., etc., etc. Interestingly, the one that we asked to turn off the phone actually suffered. One of the only 2 conditions that made people suffer. It wasn't significant, but these people suffered and actually reduced their level of nature interaction. So if you want to go to a nature reserve, tell people close your phone, they will interact less with nature. So that's an interesting result. Now, when you look at it all together, again, we see the same results. So the touch and the smell, very strong effect on the altogether the variable of nature interaction during the 30 minutes walk, and to later extend the observe and the picture. This is a mediation analysis, and the solid line represents significant effects. But also we find that the nature is the mediator for positive affectivity. So those people who smell and touch nature did more interactions and felt better after the walk. So it was actually a positive impact not only on their interaction but also on their well-being during the 30 minutes walk. So if I would like to summarize the last 30 minutes of a talk and give some take-home messages, so I think the first thing we need to remember that multifunctional landscape cannot replace protected areas. They cannot replace protected areas because they are not directed just for nature protection. And this is something we need to remember. Nature has its interesting values beside its utility for human. And when I did this figure for showing all the different elements, I put the biodiversity area is a big circle because I want to emphasize that as ecologists, I think we should first and foremost think about biodiversity when we think about these multifunctional landscapes. Again, in this area, humans are the keystone species, and therefore they have to be considered. We cannot ignore humans and have to study them, their needs, as I said before. And therefore, in this case, because it's so complex, because there are so many trade-offs and conflict, we need to look for opportunities. And in this talk, I need to look for opportunity and focus on what important for people. Income, health, in different contexts will be something slightly different. We need to identify best practices like the organic orchards or like the the vegetation in the tomatoes, a win-win or a lose-lose, and improve practices. We need to think about low-hanging fruits when there is almost no cost or some cost and some benefits, and we can invest in them, like this cues to experience, connecting people to nature. And don't forget, in averting this extinction of experience is crucial for conservation, according to what I think, as people are getting disconnected and ignorance leads to indifference. And finally, we have some high-hanging fruits like the traditional orchards of olives, in which we have to invest. When we do that, we have to make sure we invest in those areas that matter, in those areas that are ecologically important, and not fight for investing everywhere. Otherwise, we won't be able to meet our target with the limiting funding we have. So I'd like to thank my students, postdoc, PhD student, master students, Agat Koloni, Hila Segre, Maya, Tuns, Raz Simon, and Daniel Bashan for all the work. My research associate, all participants, for your attention. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed and you're enjoying the conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.